Welcome to the Issues of Life podcast, and today we are continuing a very important series that we started just a couple of weeks ago.
We've been talking about Rhett and Link, who are two pretty famous YouTubers that recently came out on their podcast saying that they used to be Christians, but they now no longer believe in Jesus, God, or the Bible. They actually made a lot of comments and a lot of statements that, if true, would pretty much dismantle Christianity. So we're just slowly walking through and dealing with some of the statements that they've made. Make sure to check out our last two videos. We talk about if they were really Christians to begin with, and we tackled one of their statements about evolution.
Before we get into today's specific argument that we wanted to address, I wanted to say something about really the point of this series of episodes, because I've had some people ask some questions, and even in the comments of the previous video, we had someone who raised some of the same questions that we're going to try to address in this episode and in future episodes as we're able. But I want to make it clear that we're not turning this into a hardcore apologetics podcast. That's not the purpose of what we're doing with the Issues of Life, though this particular series kind of demands that kind of treatment. But I really don't want to get into this whole heavy discussion of evidence. Like we said, we're not the experts. Now, both of us have studied certain issues to a greater degree than others, but we don't consider ourselves to be experts on those issues. And we don't want to get bogged down in all of that evidence. So what we really want to do is get to the heart of what's going on here with Rhett and Link and with others who struggle with the same questions. And it really comes down to presuppositions. That's where we have to start. And, we can show all the evidence in the world, but someone who doesn't believe that there is a God and that he's revealed himself to us is simply not going to be very concerned with those findings, because we base so much of it, obviously, on the revealed truth of Scripture. So when we deal with evidence, we're dealing with evidence solely for the purpose of showing those who already believe that our faith is reasonable and it is defensible. It's not just fairy tales, it's not fables, but it is true. And it's based on historical accounts which have been backed up by lots of scientific, historical, and archaeological findings. And so if the evidence is a way to open the door to someone hearing what we have to say, that's great. But the point of our podcast is not going to be to delve into all the issues of evidence, because that's not what we're about. One of the things we want to deal with, because Rhett made quite a big deal about this in his particular episode, is the issue of the Exodus. A lot of the historical information found in the first 5 books of the Bible centers on that story of the children of Israel being enslaved in Egypt for all those years, and then ultimately being delivered, the 10 plagues, the crossing of the Red Sea, wilderness wanderings, all of that. And apparently, according to Rhett, the Egyptians are supposed to be these incredible record keepers who have documented every piece of their history. And so they don't mention anything about the children of Israel, the slavery, the plagues, and all that stuff. And so if they don't mention it, then certainly it can't be true.
At face value, that seems really, really strong, because if the Egyptians are perfect historians, if they kept impeccable records, and those records don't hold proof that supports the Bible, then why do we believe the Bible? How do we know the Bible is true? But the actual fact of the matter is that the Egyptians were not perfect historians. They didn't keep impeccable records, and they were actually very well known for taking things out and leaving things out in their history. So they had a lot of writing, and you can just see that when you look at historical archaeology. Like you see all the hieroglyphs on the walls, and they have all the cuneigraph written on in clay. There was a lot of writing in ancient Egypt. However, there's also a lot of gaps in their writing. They often just wrote things that highlighted the good that came from the Pharaoh, the good that happened in Egypt. Though they may have included famines and other things like that agriculturally, you very rarely see anything that's going to take away from the name of Pharaoh, because they believed that the Pharaoh was God incarnate. He was a God who came and actually dwells among them in the flesh. And so when we look at the story about the Israelites, there were the 10 plagues, and each one of those plagues attacked one of their gods, which would have been terrible, would have been heretical. And the fact that these plagues even existed means that their gods lacked the power that they believed they had. But also, then Pharaoh, if you look in Exodus, takes his army and follows after the Israelites, their slaves, to fight them and bring them back into Egypt under slavery. And what happens? Pharaoh and all of his men die. Does it make that much sense for the Egyptians to leave that in their history if they're trying to say that Pharaoh was God? Not at all. No, that would disprove it completely. So it makes complete sense that in Egyptian history, they left out things like the Exodus, like the death of their Pharaoh, because it didn't line up with their beliefs.
So at the very least, we could say the Egyptians were not impeccable record keepers, though that might be something that sounds right. You've got to do some research for yourself, and we can certainly point you to some articles if you want to read further on that issue. But we cannot rely on those imperfect records to say that the Bible's record is inaccurate. It just isn't a strong enough argument. And so that's not a claim that I think overturns any of the historical record of Scripture. Once again, we're finding that the evidence is not that compelling, and the evidence that's provided by these people who are biased by a specific view that evidence is not the only option for explaining gaps in historical records and whatever we might find that we think disproves the historical record of the Bible. So there's something more at play there, and that's what I'm talking about. We want to get to the presuppositions. So it's not about the Bible being untenable from a historical perspective. It's more that people don't want to believe it, and so they will find the evidence that strengthens their particular bias. And I think the Bible teaches us that. I think even in Romans 1, we find that even though God clearly revealed himself, people did not want to retain him in their knowledge. And so people who don't want to retain God in their knowledge are going to find ways to ignore his existence and explain him away and do everything possible to disprove his word. But the idea of the Egyptians having no record of the Israelite slaves and the Exodus does not disprove that as a historical event. In fact, it makes plenty of sense for them to have wanted to avoid including it at all costs.
So thank you for watching this video. Make sure to check back and watch the other videos before this one, and we've got a couple more coming up. So stay tuned, like this video if you enjoyed it, and share it with somebody else, and make sure to subscribe if you want to see more.